The Joe Rogan Experience.
So the Atlantis one.
Yeah, the Wristshot structure. I was wondering if you saw those videos, Joe.
Yeah, no, that was a big one that I saw because I've been fascinated by the concept of Atlantis. Ever since I had these conversations with Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock about the Younger Dryas impact theory and this concept that somewhere in the roughly around 11,000, 12,000 years ago, we were hit by a series of comets. And it's pretty evident that that's a fact. If you do the core samples of the Earth, they find this nuclear glass all over the Earth that exists in that time period. And it seems like something happened that reset civilization. And there's very little evidence of advanced civilizations before that up until recently, up until the last couple of decades. They started uncovering things like Göbekli Tepe and all these other structures that are clearly from more than 12,000 years ago. And they're really complex and really large with enormous stones. And it's sort of caused people to rethink the history of the Earth and the history of human civilizations. And Atlantis has always been the big one. That has been the one that everybody talked about, was this incredibly advanced civilization, and no one can figure out where it is.
Right.
Or if it was real.
I think that Atlantis, because surely that wouldn't have been necessarily the name just through like the change of language, over, let's say, 12, 13,000 years ago, which would be the time frame. So like surely there would be several different changes of language, but I think it represented a civilization that was doing great things. They were more global than what many people think would be possible. Atlantis was said to be a kingdom made up of, or an empire, made up of 10 kingdoms. And then there was the lost city of Atlantis, which was the capital, which was said to be made up of concentric circles, 2 of water, 3 of land, and essentially that they were obliterated by a cataclysm as passed down by Plato, although it's worth mentioning that Plato got the story of Atlantis from Solon, who was his uncle separated by 6 generations. But what most people don't realize is that Solon had traveled to Egypt, and so it's the ancient Egyptians is where that tale comes from, which makes it even more bizarre because I would argue that the most spectacular ancient civilization is the Egyptians. I mean, no disrespect to the Romans.
Hard to deny.
Right? I mean, let me just say, because I want to, on this podcast, encourage people to travel to Egypt. Joe, you got to go.
I really want to. A friend of mine just went, and she got back, and she was telling me incredible things about it. Jamie, will you pull up the photos of these concentric circles? Tell him.
Yeah, the Wristshot, Richat. It's worth mentioning that.
Got it already here.
Yeah, in the first couple, I just want to say it's Wristshot. I used to call it Rickhot. I was mispronouncing it. But let me ask you this, Joe, real quick. When you saw my video, was that the very first time you had ever seen this thing before?
Yeah.
That's the thing. So many. When I first saw this, I was like, what the fuck is that? By the way, you see that white? All those white blemishes? That's salt. This was under the ocean. And people, let me just say, you mentioned Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock. I love them. And I know for sure that they don't particularly think this is the site for a few different reasons. So let me say there's absolute doubt. Even I am not 100% certain. I'm not even 100% certain Atlantis existed. What I am certain is that humans were doing spectacular things and a cataclysmic event happened called the Younger Dryas and reset something for somebody.
Is there a natural explanation for this formation?
Yes. So let me say that it is considered to be mysterious. They're not 100% certain of it. However, the consensus is that it was a volcanic dome that had risen and collapsed multiple times, like 100 million years ago, allegedly. I say allegedly. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that. I'm just saying I would like to know where sometimes they get these figures from. Like, explain to me why it was 100 million years ago and not 99 or 98, because here we are talking about how crazy things changed in just the last 12, 13,000 years. So when they throw around these numbers, 1 million years in itself is an incredibly long period of time. But getting back to your question, some had originally thought that maybe it was an impact site from an asteroid or perhaps, but there's no evidence for it. Like there's none of the nano.
The problem is there's these concentric circles. I've never seen anything. I mean, obviously I'm not an archaeologist, but I've never seen anything like this if you study structures that are like man-made structures, I've never seen anything like this that humans have made, but I've definitely never seen go to that one where your cursor's on, Jamie.
Please.
So is this?
You want to see some? All right.
What
I'm
is
sorry.
this? What am I?
Okay.
Okay. One step at a time, because we
Yep.
also have to take into consideration that people are just listening. So kind
Okay.
of describe what we're looking at here.
Okay, so what you're looking at is approximately 250 miles inland in the total barren desert of Mauritania, Africa. So
But
the Western
this image
Sahara.
looks like. Why is it blue?
That's just showing you
What it used to look like?
No, this is what it looks like right now through, I forgot what you call this type of animation, but it's a satellite imagery that they enhanced in order for you to see the difference in elevation and the actual structure to itself.
Okay. So like if there was water in this area, you would see it this way, that it would be these concentric circles that are raised above the water, and then the water would be inside of it like that.
Well, just to clarify, this particular image, no, this is not trying to represent water. So that blue is actually picking up on salt. So
Salt. All that was salt. But I mean, it used to be underwater, right? It's salt
Well-
because it was underwater.
that's what I believe, and that's what makes the most sense to me. Others will disagree, and let me tell you why. It is currently 1,300 feet above sea level. It's 250 miles inland. And so some people say this was never under the ocean, at least not for the last tens of millions of years, is what the scientists claim. I argue that since the salt is still there, and not only that, Jamie, if you go to the other images that show you more of the white, the one that you were previously on, the one to the middle to the left, right there. So those areas with the most white blemishes happen to be the areas that are the lowest in elevation, which to me tells me that salt water had settled there. But not only that, Joe, Atlantis was said to be, like we said, multiple rings of, water and land. However, it was said to open to the sea to the south. And what you're looking at here, the south, so this is oriented north, south, east, and west. What do you see to the south? And especially if we could get another...
This is a very flat area that looks like it's the lowest elevation. Like around it looks like it's higher. I mean, it's hard to tell from this image.
Jamie, will you Google map it? Just type in... even if you went to Mauritania, so you could see this from space. Astronauts use it as a locator, and they weren't really familiar or aware of it until the Gemini missions in the early 1960s. So if you if you just go to Google Earth, you'll be able to find this quite quickly. It stands out, and it's why they call it the Eye of Africa or the Eye of the Sahara. All right, so just pan out a little bit, and it'll provide us with keep going. All that white is salt. In fact, I have a friend, Josh Sigurdsson, that went out there and tasted that shit off the fucking ground. That's salt. Because a lot of people say, this was never under the ocean. And I'm like, all right, you see all that? Even Randall Carlson himself, which let me just say, he, for a few reasons, he favors the Azores. He doesn't think this is likely to be the location for a few reasons.
He favors what?
The Azores, the island chain, which would be, it's
And he thinks that was Atlantis?
To him, he's partial towards that. But so he analyzed this site, and you see all those striations, how it looks like the ocean, so that's all water erosion, Joe. And if you scroll in, so remember when Randall was on your show and he showed you the Missoula floodplains and all those giant ripples from the huge current that it went through? This is here. So scroll in, right there where your cursor is, Jamie. Scroll right in. You're going to see those same water ripples. Keep going, because this what you're looking at here is panned out. This is many miles. Like, keep in mind, this structure is 30 miles across.
That's crazy. That looks like the bottom of the ocean, like if you see where the water breaks on the sand.
Yep. And I have there's
that's
better
crazy.
pictures. And that, just to clarify, that white is salt. And that is because that's a lot of people don't know, Joe, that the Sahara Desert wasn't a thing until approximately 5,000 years ago. It's only in the last several years, and by the way, I'm quoting MIT research here, that the Sahara goes back and forth from green to desert approximately every 20,000 years. They believe it has something to do with the Earth's tilt, and that's worth discussing. But so this whole area, because people are like, well, that's not Atlantis. I'm like, well, first of all, if the Sahara Desert was a lush green tropical paradise, which had the largest known freshwater lakes ever known to have existed, for example, Mega Lake Chad, which it's like 3 times more water surface than all of the North American Great Lakes combined. It's a big sucker.
Holy shit. How's it not an ocean?
I know.
It's all fresh water?
It was when it existed, and that was at the time when the Sahara was green. And it also had some of the largest known rivers that were known to have existed throughout the world. I think they'd still be ranked 10th today or something like that. But so you have to, when you see this, people have to imagine that this area was once green and that because one of the arguments I make is that the fact that that salt is on top of that dirt, to me, is indicative that the ocean flowed over here far more recently than what people think.
How wide is this structure?
Okay, so
these concentric circles.
I meant to bring. I brought a laser. Do you have a laser pointer in here?
No.
It's okay. So the circles themselves is about 14.5 miles across. However, if you go the complete shebang, the whole circle itself is just shy of 30 miles.
So the whole thing is 30 miles, which would be like the size of a city.
Right. Well, keep in mind the outer ring would have been water, so that wouldn't have necessarily counted. But some people will say that this is too big according to Plato's description. And let me just say that I'm like, well, hold on a second. I don't think that we should consider that because of loss of translation, that we should consider the measurements a key detail. The question becomes, is it big enough to be a city with possibly millions of people? Because the way it was described is that it was a city that was said to be busy all day, all night, rich in trade, with languages spoken from all over. So I'm like, okay, that would imply millions of people. I mean, if a city's busy all day and all night, I think of large metropolitan areas like New York, Chicago, London, whatever. And so if this was indeed an ancient or a site of an ancient civilization, well, then it would have. I mean, they're obviously not going to have skyscrapers, so it would have to be an area big enough to sustain that many people, and the Wristshot structure certainly does.
And so the idea would be that this would lead out to the ocean, and that these circles would be where the water is, and then the ridges would be where the structures are, where the houses and the buildings are.
And people will say, well, where is that stuff now? I'm like, well, look at it. It got obliterated.
Those people should shut the fuck up.
well,
but if you just look at what's going on with the sand and those clear water erosion marks on the sand, but that also could be wind, right? Couldn't the way that the ripples in that sand, couldn't that be wind?
Both. However, just to clarify.
Is that sand that is where the cursor's at right there?
Yes, that's all sand. However, it's also actually to the right where it says layers, Jamie, can you scroll in right there? Because that will show you the ripples more. So it's a combination of sand and rock.
You mean to the left?
Right there. That's what I'm talking about. Those are giant ripples. And I'm quoting Randall Carlson, who I consider to be an expert on geological formations. And so, yeah.
Right, but isn't that what wind-driven sand looks like? If you go to dunes look like that.
Yeah, and undoubtedly.
But hold on, this is sand, right?
Yes, well, it's combination, rock and sand in between.
Right, but this is like what it would look like if wind-driven sand and rock underneath it.
Right, so what the implication is that it was blasted by water, and then after that, the wind has done its thing and moved the sand all over it and in between.
So 20,000 years ago, this was all green, lush forest?
No, Joe. 5,000.
5,000?
So
really?
Yes. So I could show you.
When did they think Atlantis was?
11,600 is allegedly when it was destroyed, which mirrors the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. Because so Plato so this is 600 BC, and Plato said that it happened 9,000 years earlier. So that would be 11,600 years ago, which coincides with the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, which makes it so compelling. To me, that is actual scientific evidence that indicates that Atlantis actually existed. Because it's very specific.
It is very specific, but it's not scientific, right? It's like there's no real evidence.
Okay, let me rephrase. That a civilization, let me rephrase. A civilization got fucked.
Yeah.
11,600. So never mind Atlantis. Let me rephrase. A civilization was around. The stories of it were passed down, and they got obliterated. So that's what I'm implying.
Well, we definitely know that the Younger Dryas impact theory is extremely plausible. There are, without a doubt, like many impact points on Earth where they find this tritonite, this nuclear glass, which you can get either from a nuclear explosion or you get it from some sort of a meteor impact, large scale, all over the continent. And we know that all over the planet, I should say. We know that happened. This is like real hardcore geological evidence. So if we know that there were structures before that, which we do now because of Göbekli Tepe and a few other places that they're reasonably sure were pre 11,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, then we know that something was around back then that was very sophisticated. How sophisticated, we don't know.